October 17th, 11:42 p.m. A kitchen light hums softly in a nearly silent apartment. A man stands barefoot on cool tile, one hand resting on the edge of the counter. The conversation ended 20 minutes ago, but its echo still lingers in the room like cigarette smoke. On the table, his phone lies face down, no new messages. He had tried at first. He clarified his tone. He reworded his intention. He softened his phrasing. And somewhere between the third and fourth attempt, something inside him went still. Not angry. Not defeated. Still. He doesn't pace, he doesn't rehearse better arguments in his head. He doesn't draft a final, perfect paragraph that will finally make the other person see him clearly. He just stops. If you were standing there, you might mistake it for exhaustion, but look closer. There's no slump in his posture, no visible hurt. His breathing is slow, measured. Something has shifted. From a Jungian perspective, this is rarely about the other person at all. It marks a subtle but decisive movement away from the persona, the carefully shaped outer identity we craft to be received, accepted, understood. For years, maybe decades, he had refined that persona. The reasonable one. The self-aware one. The emotionally articulate one. The one who could always explain himself. Because explaining had become survival, as a child perhaps clarity kept peace, as a teenager articulation secured belonging, as an adult precision protected reputation. Misunderstanding once felt dangerous. Like being erased. So he learned to over-explain. He added context no one asked for. He softened statements before anyone objected. He clarified tone before anyone misread it. He built bridges before conflict could even form. But tonight, standing in that quiet kitchen, something inside him recognizes a truth he cannot unsee. If someone is committed to misunderstanding you, no arrangement of words will rescue you. And that realization doesn't sting. It frees. The hum of the light continues. Outside, a car passes slowly down the street. The world moves, he remains still. You can almost feel the subtle reorientation happening inside him, like a compass needle adjusting after years of interference. From a Jungian lens, this is the beginning of an inward turn, the self disentangling from its dependence on reflection. The persona begins to loosen its grip, not because it failed, but because it is no longer needed in the same way. For the first time, he does not feel the urgency to be seen correctly. He feels sufficient. It's a quiet threshold, no applause, no visible milestone. But internally, something monumental has occurred. The urge to be understood has begun to dissolve. And once that urge fades, something else begins to take its place. The shift didn't begin that night. It had been building for years. Long before the quiet kitchen, long before the phone placed face down in deliberate calm, it began in smaller rooms, earlier conversations, subtle rehearsals of identity. At 14, sitting across from a teacher who misunderstood his silence as defiance. At 22, explaining to a partner why he needed space, but softening it so it wouldn't sound like rejection. At 30, clarifying a boundary in the workplace, layering it with reassurance so no one would think him difficult. Each moment seemed harmless, responsible even. But over time a pattern formed. He didn't just speak. He managed perception. He didn't just express himself. He curated interpretation. From a Jungian perspective, this is the persona at work not as deception but as adaptation. The persona develops as a bridge between the inner world and society. It allows us to function, to cooperate, to survive collective life. But there is a hidden cost. When the persona becomes overdeveloped, it begins to negotiate for worth. You can almost see it like a military outpost at the border of the psyche, constantly scanning the horizon for threat. Misinterpretation becomes enemy fire, silence becomes suspicious, ambiguity feels like exposure. So he fortified. He clarified. He anticipated objections. He preemptively apologized for feelings he hadn't even expressed yet. Each explanation felt like securing higher ground. But slowly he realized something unsettling. The more he explained, the less solid he felt. Because over-explaining is rarely about communication, it's about control. Control of how you're perceived. Control of how you're remembered. Control of whether you're approved. And control, no matter how subtle, carries tension. In conversations, you can almost hear it. The slight tightening in the voice, the careful stacking of words, the extra paragraph that was necessary but feels indispensable. If you've ever done it, you know the sensation. You say something simple. Then you add context. Then a disclaimer. Then a reassurance. Then a joke to lighten it. By the time you're finished, the original truth is diluted. Why? Because somewhere deep inside, misunderstanding still feels like abandonment. Carl Jung believed that the self seeks wholeness, but the ego often seeks validation. And when the ego is entangled with the persona, validation becomes oxygen. But oxygen can become dependency. And dependency creates fear. Fear that if someone misreads you, they will withdraw. Fear that if someone doesn't fully grasp your intention, your value diminishes. Fear that silence from others means something is wrong. So the explanations continue. Until one day the psyche grows tired. Not resentful. Tired. There's a difference. Resentment says they don't deserve my explanation. Maturity says my explanation is no longer required. That's what began to form beneath the surface in the months leading up to that October night. Small experiments in restraint. A text left uncorrected. A comment not clarified. A boundary stated once and not defended twice. At first it felt reckless, almost irresponsible, like abandoning a post. But nothing catastrophic happened. The world didn't collapse. Relationships didn't disintegrate overnight. Reputation didn't shatter. Something else happened instead. He felt quieter inside. Less scattered. Because every time you over-explain, a portion of your energy leaves you. It travels outward trying to secure interpretation. When you stop doing that, that energy stays. And what returns with it is unfamiliar at first. Stability. The psyche begins to reorganize around an internal axis instead of external approval. From a Jungian perspective, this marks a movement toward individuation, the process of becoming centered in one's own inner authority. But individuation is lonely at first. Because when you stop negotiating for recognition, you also stop chasing reassurance. And in that silence, a question emerges. If I am not constantly explaining myself, who am I when misunderstood? That question doesn't have an immediate answer. And the mind resists it. But the body already knows. Standing in that kitchen, he wasn't numb, he wasn't detached. He was anchored. Misunderstanding no longer felt like erasure, it felt like filtration. Not everyone is meant to understand you. And for the first time, that realization did not wound him. It strengthened him. But strength without explanation changes the dynamic of every relationship around you. And not everyone will be comfortable with that. The first time he didn't explain himself, the room felt different. It was a Thursday afternoon, conference table, glass walls, a muted skyline stretching behind polished reflections, 4 colleagues, 1 decision. He stated his position clearly, calmly. And then he stopped. No qualifying sentence. No gentle cushioning. No anticipatory defense. The silence that followed was subtle but charged. One colleague shifted in her seat, another leaned back waiting for the usual elaboration. It didn't come. You can almost feel the tension in moments like this. The social contract expects continuity. When someone who typically explains chooses not to, the space fills with uncertainty. Is he upset? Is he disengaged? Is something wrong? But nothing was wrong. He simply didn't feel compelled to manage their perception. From a Jungian perspective, this is the persona beginning to relinquish its overextension, not disappearing but stepping back. The energy once used to negotiate interpretation remains internal, strengthening the center. Silence in this form is not withdrawal, it is containment. Containment carries weight. When someone no longer rushes to soften their stance, their presence shifts, words become fewer, more deliberate, and because they are fewer, they carry more gravity. But gravity unsettles people who are used to buoyancy. In personal relationships, the shift is even more pronounced. A friend misreads a message. Instead of crafting a paragraph to correct the tone, he responds simply, "That wasn't my intention." And nothing more. No essay. No emotional scaffolding. No performance of reassurance. At first, the friend presses, "Are you sure? You seem distant." In the past, he would have stepped in to repair the discomfort immediately. Now, he lets the discomfort breathe. Because he has realized something unsettling but liberating. Other people's discomfort is not always his responsibility to resolve. That realization marks the true turning point. Carl Jung believed that individuation requires confronting the shadow, not just the darker impulses but the disowned parts of ourselves. For him, one shadow element had always been this quiet firmness, this refusal to chase approval. He once labeled it cold, arrogant, unkind. But what if it was simply strength without apology? The moment he stopped explaining, another truth surfaced. Many of his explanations had not been acts of kindness, they had been bids for safety. If you understand me, you won't leave. If you understand me, you won't reject me. If you understand me, I remain intact. But the self that depends on universal understanding is fragile. It fractures at every misinterpretation. Now something steadier is emerging. In conversations, he notices a shift. When someone misunderstands him, there is no immediate spike of urgency in his chest, no racing internal monologue crafting corrections. There is space. And in that space, he asks himself a different question. Does this misunderstanding threaten who I am? Or does it simply reveal who they are? The distinction is quiet but transformative. When you no longer experience misunderstanding as an existential threat, your nervous system recalibrates. You begin to conserve energy that was once spent on defense. Energy returns to posture, to gaze, to tone. You speak slower. You choose words more carefully, not to control perception but because you no longer feel rushed. Silence becomes less of a void and more of a boundary. And boundaries unsettle people who benefited from your over-explaining. Some relationships grow strained. You may notice it yourself, the subtle shift when you stop clarifying every emotion. Some people interpret your quiet as distance, others as indifference. But what they are actually encountering is solidity. Solidity doesn't chase. Solidity doesn't overcompensate. Solidity stands. And standing without constant translation feels foreign at first. Because there is a hidden grief in this transition. You begin to realize how much of your identity was built around being the understandable one, the bridge builder, the emotional translator. If you are no longer that, who are you becoming? That question lingers in the background. Because when you stop over-explaining, something else begins to surface. Not louder. Deeper. And that depth carries its own quiet consequence. Winter arrives without announcement. December 3rd, 6:18 a.m. Frost edges the windows, the city hasn't fully woken yet. He sits alone with a cup of black coffee, steam rising in thin spirals that disappear into the pale morning light. No music, no notifications, just the low hum of the heater and the distant sound of a bus braking at the corner. There was a time when mornings like this would have been heavy. Silence used to amplify doubt. Now it sharpens clarity. Over the past weeks, something subtle but irreversible has happened. A few invitations stopped arriving, a certain friend became less responsive, a colleague grew more distant. No confrontation, no dramatic fallout. Just quiet rearrangement. And strangely, he feels lighter. This is the part no one talks about. When you stop explaining yourself, you don't just change your internal world, you alter the ecosystem around you. Relationships built on constant reassurance begin to falter. Dynamics that relied on your emotional labor lose their fuel. From a Jungian perspective, individuation always disrupts existing structures. When the self reorganizes around its own center, external bonds must recalibrate or dissolve. And dissolution, though quiet, can be precise. He notices who leans in with curiosity rather than assumption, who asks questions instead of projecting conclusions, who allows ambiguity without panic. The others drift. Not with hostility, with incompatibility. You can almost picture it like sediment settling in water. When the agitation stops, the contents separate naturally. What is heavy sinks, what is aligned remains suspended. Misunderstanding, once feared, now functions as a filter. If someone misinterprets him and immediately withdraws, that withdrawal reveals something. It reveals the conditional nature of the connection. It exposes how much of the bond depended on his constant adjustment. And that knowledge, though sobering, is clean. Carl Jung believed that wholeness requires differentiation, the courage to become distinct from collective expectation. But differentiation creates distance. Not everyone can accompany you into that interior territory. He begins to see this clearly. There was a period in his life when he would have chased the distance, sent the extra message, clarified the misunderstood tone, repaired the minor fracture before it widened. Now he watches. Not passively, not coldly. Just attentively. If a bond cannot survive without his perpetual explanation, perhaps it was never rooted in understanding to begin with. That realization is both liberating and isolating. Because here is the deeper truth. When you no longer feel the need to be understood, you also relinquish the fantasy that everyone will stay. And yet there is no bitterness in him. Only recognition. He remembers a conversation months ago, someone accusing him of being hard to read. In the past, that comment would have sent him inward, dissecting tone, expression, phrasing. Now it registers differently. Hard to read, or simply not performing transparency on demand. There is a difference. Transparency offered freely is intimacy. Transparency extracted to ease another's anxiety is compliance. The quiet strength growing inside him refuses compliance. You can almost feel the structural change in his posture when he walks now, shoulders level, movements unhurried, eye contact steady but unforced. He is not withholding himself, he is simply no longer distributing himself indiscriminately. Misunderstanding reveals who expects access without effort. And for the first time, he is not rushing to grant it. The morning light shifts across the kitchen floor, the coffee has gone lukewarm, outside the city accelerates into its daily rhythm. Inside something is stabilized. But stability invites a deeper confrontation. If misunderstanding is no longer threatening, if explanation is no longer necessary, then what exactly is he protecting now? And more importantly, what part of him was never meant to be translated in the first place? January 12, 9:37 p.m. A small gathering, dim lights, low music threading through quiet conversation. He stands near the edge of the room, not withdrawn, just observant. A glass rests loosely in his hand. Across from him, two people debate something trivial but animated. Laughter rises, opinions sharpen. Someone turns to him. "You've been quiet, what do you think?" There was a time when that question would have triggered a subtle performance. He would have assembled a balanced response, measured, articulate, carefully textured so no one felt dismissed. Tonight he answers simply, "I don't see it that way." Nothing more. The air shifts for half a second, not hostile, just recalibrating. He doesn't rush to elaborate. He doesn't dilute it with humor. He doesn't smooth it over. And something remarkable happens, nothing collapses. The conversation moves, one person nods thoughtfully, another shrugs. The world does not fracture because he chose precision over persuasion. In that moment you can feel it, the final thread loosening. From a Jungian perspective, this is the integration phase. The persona no longer dominates the interaction. The inner self does not seek constant external mirroring to confirm its shape. There is a core now, quiet, self-contained. And it does not panic when left unvalidated. He steps outside for air. The night is cold, breath visible in faint clouds. Streetlights cast amber halos on wet pavement. Distant traffic hums like a low tide. He leans against the railing and feels something unfamiliar. Relief. Not the relief of being understood. The relief of no longer needing to be. Because here is the deeper realization, one that arrives slowly, almost imperceptibly. Some parts of you were never meant for mass comprehension. Not because they are superior. Not because they are secretive. But because they are sacred. Sacred things are not explained casually, they are revealed selectively. In earlier years, he mistook constant accessibility for authenticity. He believed that if people misunderstood him, it meant he had failed to communicate clearly enough. Now he sees it differently. Authenticity is not the act of exposing every layer. It is the act of standing firmly in what you choose to reveal and what you choose to keep. Carl Jung believed that the individuation process requires a descent into the inner world, a confrontation with the deeper self beyond social roles. But what emerges from that descent is not loud, it is not dramatic. It is steady, and steadiness does not beg for recognition. He thinks back to that October night in the kitchen, the phone face down, the hum of the light, the first moment he chose silence over explanation. At the time, it felt like surrender. Now he understands it was consolidation. Energy reclaimed. Identity recentered. Worth no longer outsourced. When someone misunderstands him now, he does not experience it as erasure. He experiences it as information. Information about compatibility. About projection. About alignment. And in that information there is power. You can almost feel the difference in his presence now. Fewer words, more weight, a kind of emotional economy that makes each statement deliberate. There is no urgency in him. And without urgency, there is no fear. The music inside grows louder as someone opens the door behind him. Laughter spills into the night. He finishes his drink and stands for a moment longer looking at the city. He realizes something simple, almost startling in its clarity. Being understood is beautiful. But being rooted is freedom. And when you are rooted, misunderstanding cannot uproot you. It simply passes through. The camera lingers on the stillness of the street, on his steady breath, on the quiet confidence of someone who no longer negotiates for recognition. Somewhere along the way, the need to be understood dissolved. What remains is something rarer. A self that stands without translation,